There is a great deal of speculation as to what is going to happen in Afghanistan militarily. And during that time, of course, the Taliban will then decide, well, we might as well step up, our activities, and the danger then of a much larger civil war, not just between the government and the Taliban, but between the various warlord factions who have stakes in the election, could take place. This is what I would call the worst case scenario. So my first point is the political transition in Afghanistan is absolutely vital and paramount, much more important than anything else. Number two, is the West going to back Afghanistan if there is a successful political transition? Is the West going to back it economically? Unfortunately, the American presence in Afghanistan, despite spending $1 trillion, 80 billion of which was for social welfare and economic development, we still do not have a viable, sustainable economy in Afghanistan. I mean, forget Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, that the fact that you have to send 1 million people outside, I mean, nobody will have jobs really after the Americans leave. Tens of thousands of jobs were given because of the troops, 140,000 troops, and tens of thousands of Afghans were servicing these troops. All these jobs will go. And there's no real economy to sustain another job. When I was a kid and I used to travel to Afghanistan with my parents in the 60s, Afghanistan was self-sustaining in food. Today, it has to import food. 12 years after the American presence, it is still importing food. And Afghanistan, like you, is an agricultural country. Why? Because 1/3 of the land is being given over to poppy and heroin. And 1/3 of the land is not available for food production. So we don't have a viable economy. And so Afghanistan is going to remain for several years more a real basket case in need of foreign contributions. But given the world system at the moment, the American retreat, the lack of the economic crisis in Europe, the economic crisis in the United States, the criticism on President Obama that he's not spending enough money at home. Why is he building schools in Kabul and other way? He should be building schools in Wisconsin or in New York or somewhere. So all these issues are going to create a crisis. The third issue is that, unfortunately, there has not been sufficient diplomatic work done for a regional framework which could enhance peace and stability in Afghanistan. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you know a little bit of history, in the 90s, Afghanistan's civil war was fueled by all the neighbors. Pakistan was backing the Taliban. India was backing what was then the Northern Alliance, which was made up of Tajiks and Uzbeks. Uzbekistan and Tajikistan were also backing that alliance, so was Iran. So there was a complete confrontation in the region between Pakistan and the Arab countries who were backing the Taliban and all the other countries who were backing the Northern Alliance. Now, the Afghans' biggest fear is that is going to be repeated again. There will be a breakdown, and then all these countries are going to jump in, supporting one side or the other, one warlord or the other. They've all got their favorite warlords still. And that crisis is going to be obviously this time round much worse, because now you've got Al-Qaeda, you've got all these militant groups, etc., etc. What we need was a regional peace conference or a regional framework in which there would be a pledge, possibly guaranteed by the UN Security Council, that the neighbors would not interfere in the internal affairs of Afghanistan. They would not send money, weapons, training, etc., etc., into Afghanistan. Now, we don't have that agreement. The Americans are leaving without conducting this agreement. There was an American official, Richard Holbrooke, who was in charge of AFPAC, many years ago who wanted to do this and was seriously intent on doing this, but unfortunately the US administration has been deeply divided on many of these issues that I'm talking about. Shall we eliminate drugs? Shall we not eliminate drugs? Shall we build is it our responsibility to build a regional framework? Well, of course it's your responsibility. You're the big power here. You've occupied the country. Nobody else has. And, people would support you if you actually spent some diplomatic effort doing this. Anyway, this was not done. The fourth issue was reconciliation with the Taliban. Now, I don't know, again, in 2010 and 11, there was reconciliation, process of reconciliation, and US Taliban direct talks did start. Unfortunately, they broke down. It's a long saga. It's in my last book, Pakistan. God, I can't even remember the title of my last book. Anyway,
too many books.
Anyway, it's in my last book. But the talks broke down between the Americans, and so I think the Taliban, there is a lobby in the Taliban that is ready for peace. But they're not going to compromise, and they're not going to throw it away. And I think if we have a good election in Afghanistan, meaning a legitimate election, not rigged, I think the Taliban down the road would be ready for peace. And would be ready for some kind of dialogue about first a ceasefire, then possibly power sharing. And if there is to be an American leftover basing force of 5,000 to 10,000 troops, obviously there would be discussions that this force would stay for a limited amount of time, etc. So what I'm trying to say here is that reconciliation with the Taliban broke down 2.5 years ago, and nothing more was done about it. And this departure is taking place without any political strategy in place, either by the Americans or by the Afghans or by any of the neighboring states. And lastly, I will say Pakistan has been both a problem, a huge problem, and at some level a help. Pakistan has kept the entire Taliban leadership on its soil. The Taliban Shura, or council, is based in Pakistan. Muhammad Umar, Mullah Umar, the leader of the Taliban, is also based in Pakistan. And I think the Pakistanis, for many years after 9/11, the Pakistanis clandestinely continued to support the Taliban for again a multiple of reasons which I can go into if you like later on, but they did it. I think now what has happened in Pakistan is, of course, what people like myself were saying 10 years ago, that if you continue supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan, you will get blowback. And if you guys know what blowback is, you do something and that same thing comes to bite you. And that is what happened. We now have the creation of the Pakistani Taliban on our soil. And the Pakistani Taliban have an agenda of attacking the army, civil society, and trying to create a revolution in Pakistan and bring about Sharia and a caliphate and all these kinds of things. And we now, the Pakistan army has lost 4,000 soldiers fighting the Taliban, and tens of thousands of civilians have died. I'm not going to go into detail in Pakistan. It needs another lecture because we're in a very bad situation. We have 3 insurgencies going on simultaneously in Pakistan, of which one is the Taliban insurgency, and a very dire economic crisis and all the other problems. This is really what I've described to you, the military transition, the need for the political transition, the economic survival, a regional framework, reconciliation with the Taliban, Pakistan. These are all the issues associated with a peaceful settlement in Afghanistan. And of course, none of these issues have really been addressed. And that's why I'm a little bit pessimistic that things are suddenly going to become all hunky-dory and fine as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Now, what is going to be the fallout in Central Asia of all this? Well, my message here simply has been, we should all be preparing for the worst. And if something good happens in these elections and there's relative peace and relative stability in Afghanistan, well, good. But you should prepare for the worst. Now, what is the worst case scenario as far as Central Asia is concerned? Well, the first thing, obviously, the big danger of an extensive, long war in Afghanistan is the issue of refugees. You had a large refugee population. Well, you didn't, but the Tajiks did. But certainly this time, you still have, I think, several hundred Afghan refugees living in Kyrgyzstan. And the Tajiks would probably force thousands of refugees to come into Kyrgyzstan. And, so any intensive fighting is going to lead to a refugee situation, which frankly, your economies can't cope with. I mean, just yesterday we heard that Lebanon had got 1 million Syrian refugees. I mean, Lebanon is completely drowning in refugees. The second issue would be drugs. I don't need to tell you about that. I think drugs, the transit, you are a transit country for the drugs trade between Afghanistan and Western Europe. And there are many transit countries which include almost all the Central Asian states. And a lot of the corruption and a lot of the destabilization and a lot of the drug intake in your own countries is taken up because you're a transit country. And it suits the drug traffickers to make this not just a transit country, but make this a consumer country as well. And obviously to corrupt the elite, to corrupt the political elite, the military elite, the security elite, that is what suits them. Not, of course, also realizing that is, of course, by corrupting the security elite and all that, what you're doing is you're undermining your own stability. Because then that same security elite is not in a position to defend the country against extremism. The third issue is obviously we are on the verge of seeing a new configuration between the three big powers in which Kyrgyzstan stands in the middle, the US, China and Russia. How is this configuration going to work out? The Americans are on the retreat. They're pulling out of Kyrgyzstan. They're pulling out of Afghanistan. In the long term, they may well retreat from this region more generally. They will reduce aid, for example. I think one of the misconceptions here amongst some people is that somehow Kyrgyzstan is vital to US security. And that the Americans will never leave and they'll never chop aid. Well, the reality is Kyrgyzstan is not vital to American security. And there's every chance that Kyrgyzstan will become, I won't say irrelevant, but almost irrelevant in geostrategic terms. I would still say Uzbekistan, despite all the authoritarianism and all, is probably more vital to U.S. security. So how the U.S. will treat Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, these countries, I think still has to be seen. But again, this is something that, in my opinion, is they're going to walk away from Pakistan too. They're so fed up with Pakistan. They're giving us something like $2 billion a year to $3 billion, hell of a lot of money. We're not going to get that money by next year. Congress is going to slash that money. And I keep telling my fellow Pakistanis, I said, forget it. You're not going to, all these NGOs, all this stuff that you're running on American US aid money, it's not going to be coming anymore. The Afghans are going to suffer. And people forget that there's a crisis in America. A political crisis, an economic crisis, and a crisis on foreign policy. Americans are no longer interested in playing a foreign policy role in the wider world. I mean, look what's happening in the Middle East. The civil wars are continuing, Syria, Iraq, etc., with very little American strategic direction being given. So, Russia. What role after Ukraine? What role exactly is Russia going to play? Is it going to put, if it's going to put real pressure on countries like you to join the customs union as quickly as possible, when perhaps Kyrgyzstan wants a year or 2 or 3, because you've got all these problems with the free trade that you do from China, and your economic problems better than I do. But what is Russia's attitude going to be? Towards you. And then this idea that whether we like it or not, I said today to someone that Kyrgyzstan is an island of democracy surrounded by sharks. And in reality, that's what you are. You are surrounded by sharks. But you've set up a political system which, in my opinion, is very good and very legitimate and very praiseworthy, but it's not a system that is liked by any of your neighbors. And what role is that going to have? What role is that going to play, etc. In the future? And China. China's got a huge stake in Central Asia. The oil and gas, this trade, the trade through Central Asia into Russia, etc. And China is not going to allow Russia to dominate and all the rest of it. So I think that's the third fallout. Now I come to the real fallout, which would affect me very much, and I think would affect you, is the role of extremism in Central Asia. Look, I spent a lot of time just before 9/11 and after following the IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, and I have a book out on it called Jihad, which actually I've tried to give to you, to your library maybe. But anyway, the IMU joined up with, as you know, the Taliban and with the Al-Qaeda in 2000 in Afghanistan. And they were then defeated basically by the Americans. Their leaders were killed, or more or less, by the Americans. And they retreated into Pakistan. When I knew the IMU, there were Tajiks and Uzbeks were members. You could speak Persian, Parsi, and you could communicate with the IMU. Today, the IMU, of course, if you spoke Russian, because a lot of them were ex-Russian soldiers, actually, Soviet army soldiers. Today, the IMU composes of every single nationality of Central Asia, including the Kyrgyz, including Uyghurs from China, including Turkomans. Now you imagine Turkmenistan is one of the most closed societies in the world, and you wonder how on earth Turkmens, one, became radicalized, from where, because there's enormous state control there, and two, how do they get out of there to join the IMU in Pakistan and Afghanistan? But they are there. And then the Caucasian Muslim nationalities, like the Dagestanis and the Chechens and all the rest of it. So the IMU today is a pan-Islamic movement. We don't know its numbers, but it essentially has bases in the tribal areas of Pakistan. It also has numbers in Kunduz, which is in northern Afghanistan, and just close to the border with Tajikistan. But the most important threat, in my opinion, is that they together with Al-Qaeda, the Pakistani Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, the IMU, this other Central Asian group, which is called the Islamic Jihad Union, and with a number of Pakistani groups, is trying to establish a base area in northeastern Afghanistan. These are the provinces of Badakhshan, the Afghan province, not the Tajik province, the Afghan province of Badakhshan, Nuristan, and Kunar. And already we have up to 1,500 to 2,000 Pakistani Taliban based there. That's where they go to escape the onslaught of the Pakistan army. When the Pakistan army chases them, they go over to the border and live there. The IMU is there too. And the strategic importance of this corridor, in my opinion, is that first of all, the whole corridor borders Pakistan. So as far as your logistics are concerned, your food, your equipment, recruits, your connections with the outside world, it's all through Pakistan. It also borders the northeastern corner of Tajikistan. And through the Wakhan corridor, it also borders China and Kyrgyzstan. So here you have an area which is strategically a vital part of Central Asia's security, which is now not occupied by the Afghan army or by the Americans, but by these extremist groups. And for me, that poses perhaps the most important immediate threat. Now, when people say, and I've heard this a lot here in Bishkek, they're all finished and it's all over and they've gone home. And I said, look, the fact, we don't know what they're up to, but a group that has kept itself alive in a foreign country, or two foreign countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, kept itself alive for 14 years, despite all these drone missiles and the CIA and everything else, obviously has kept itself alive for a purpose. It has not kept itself alive just for nothing. And it has not come into Afghanistan as in occupying this area and this strategic corridor. It is doing so for a purpose. Now, so give it credit that it has some strategic vision. It has a vision for itself. Now, I mean, I'm not going to speculate, but certainly I think crossing the border into Central Asia and having a political effect in Central Asia is vital. Is part of that vision. Now, you know, when it happens, how it happens, you know, a diplomat told me just yesterday, said, oh, you know, we haven't heard from them for so long. I said, precisely. This is a long war they're fighting. They're not fighting a war like you, that you go into a country and then you pull out. They're fighting a long war. You know, I mean, for them, this is a generational conflict. This may go on 30 years. Look at the Taliban. I mean, they've been fighting for 45 years, if you count, since the Soviet invasion. So, I think there is a threat. It's very real. Now, you know, again, what do I see here? You know, there is no unity amongst the Central Asian states after 22 years of independence. You know, when I was here during the breakup of the Soviet Union, and I interviewed all the presidents at that time. You can't do it now because nobody will give you access. But you know, at that time there were no journalists here, and I had access. And I remember even then, this was before December 91, and they were still presidents of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Kyrgyzstan. So, and they spent half the interview complaining about the next president. You know, now, and I can only imagine that this is exactly the same situation today, 22 years on. And unfortunately, I mean, you know, I mean, most of the regimes are still being ruled by the same, you know, guys. The problem here is that, you know, you cannot fight extremism individually. Given you know, you can only fight it collectively. And that is the geography of, if I may use the word, Turkestan. You know, that is the geography of this region. There is no way you can fight this, you know, as an individual country. I mean, can you imagine securing the borders? I mean, the 1,300 kilometer or 1,400 kilometer border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan, or securing the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And you know, I mean, these are impossible tasks. I mean, these are, you know, you can throw 200,000 soldiers at the task, and it won't be done. So you need a collective security plan. And unfortunately, I don't see at the moment the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which I'm sure you studied, as yet coming up with a real kind of, you know, I mean, until Shanghai is able to get the Central Asians to work together as a political force, this kind of counterterrorism military help that they're giving is not going to be sufficient to actually help, you know, counter the extremist threat. So, and then, you know, I mean, if you look at all the problems that you were facing or your parents were facing back when I was around in 91, 92, which is water, how do you know, share the water, how do you share the electricity, the gas, the oil, etc., etc. All the same problems. You're hearing all the same problems all over again, because none of the problems have gone away. In fact, we all know they've got much worse and much more precarious. So again, geography, the use of, you know, resources, and all this, you know, will lead to economic development. Again, economic development here cannot be sustained individually. You know, state number one has one item, state number two has a second item. They both need the items. They both have to trade these items freely. You know, they can't hog and sit there on the item number one and say, we won't give item number one to anyone. You know. So again, the whole economic development rests on cooperation. And lastly, let me just say two words about, you know, this. Again, there's been a lot of issue raised about the spread of extremism. Look, First of all, I think there's no doubt that some degree of state control is needed. And the very first thing one has to say, the experience of many countries, is that you cannot allow foreign religious leaders to come and set up mosques and madrasas in your own country. Now that means that you have to then train your own people in your Islamic tradition, which is so melded with Sufism and all sorts of other kinds. I mean, there has to emerge a Kyrgyz Islamic tradition or a Uzbek Islamic tradition, which will not need foreigners to come and teach you how to be a good Muslim. Because the arrogance of foreigners who come and teach you that you're naive, you've lived under the Soviets, you're ex-communist, you have no idea what Islam is about, we'll teach you Islam. And what invariably they teach you is sectarianism. That, by the way, we're teaching you the Islam of our sect. And all the other sects are bad and evil. So please, condemn them and don't work with them. Now, that is what has plagued Pakistan and is plaguing Afghanistan. It's not just a question of Shia Sunni, and you don't have large numbers of Shia here, but the sectarianism within the Sunni religion now in Pakistan, faith is indescribably bad. Sunnis are killing Sunnis. And certainly in Central Asia, you've always had this, going back to pre-Tsarist days and all the rest of it. I mean, you had a kind of Muslim unity that has really been unprecedented, and that has never existed in the Indian subcontinent, for example. You have believed in God and you have practiced religion in a certain way. Now, those traditions, I think, have to be revived, and so I think that is the first. A spread of extremism. The second is education, how you deal with Islamic education. What kind of textbooks are you preparing? What kind of, and how are you teaching the kids and the new generation? So that they are welded and melded into a Kyrgyz tradition which is locally based and which has roots that they can hear and feel from their parents and their grandparents and all the rest of it. And the third thing is crucial to all this is economic development. I mean, there have to be real jobs for people. And young people coming out of schools and factories have to have real jobs in the country and not have to, leave the country and go and seek work elsewhere. So, and lastly, I think it is important that that the government does involve civil society and NGOs and women's groups and all sorts of stakeholders who do have a stake in trying to create a sensitivity and a consensus about how religion should be practiced in the state. So that means, if you had a commission today made up of government officials, security officials, but also NGOs, civil society, and others, who could regularly sit down and discuss about extremism and the dangers of what is happening now, what is happening to our children, etc., I think that would be hugely helpful. So, the state does have a role. Okay, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much for your patience.
I guess the best thing would be to take 3 questions for the first round. Please be short and identify yourself first.
Thank you, Mr. Rashid. As a person coming from Kyrgyzstan, it's difficult for me to imagine democracy happening in Afghanistan. Moreover, I think it's, as long as we believe and support this argument, we will keep facing threats from Afghanistan. What do you think? Is Afghanistan ready for a democracy?
Look,
Can we accept 3?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. There's one. Yeah, please.
Yeah, there have been ongoing peace talks between Pakistani government and the Taliban. So what impact will they have on Afghanistan if, in case they succeeded, or in case they fail?
And the last, Ruslan, you want it? Well, yeah.
So, sir, 2 questions, very short question. One is that we are surpassing mistake. but it's not the fact that going on in Afghanistan since I'm from there. So we have Afghan National Security Forces, more than 300,000, and it is going to Afghanistan going to sign the bilateral security agreement with America, and it is not the worst case scenario will not come, I think. And the second question is that who is the Taliban? Because there are three assumptions behind that, including your book. One is that America themselves is the creator of the Taliban, because they created 90,000 mujahideen against USSR to come Afghanistan. And second one is that the official says in Afghanistan and Pakistan that there are a secret war going on between the intelligence service of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and Taliban is supported by the ISI. And the third one is that the Taliban is just an ideological group and they are fighting for Islam with black and white discourses. So who are the Taliban?
Thank you.
Okay, wow. Let me just say that I don't think anybody is expecting a British parliamentary system to emerge in Kabul day after tomorrow. What we are all hoping for is that an election takes place and a new president is elected, who will be accepted by the majority of Afghan people. And by that I mean maybe only 70% of the people accept him, or even 60. But someone who is accepted by the majority and, of course, by the international community. So we are lowering the barrier for democracy. I mean, we are asking for a minimal change of leadership, a minimal choice to be made. We're not asking at the moment for enormous democratic institutions and judiciary and free press and everything to be functioning day after tomorrow. All I think the Afghans want and the international community wants is a peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next. And that would allow the new president to start building the institutions of democracy. So I'm not saying that it's plagued with ethnic problems, with drugs problems, with many problems.